My name is Chase Dilworth, and I have the pleasure of sharing a little bit, opening up this book with you this morning. And as we continue our series through the things I wish Jesus never said. Two things I want to remind us of this morning. I know that we have been in the series for a little bit now, and yet it's always good for a reminder. And the first one is this: Jesus. I don't know if you know this or not, but Jesus is the most important person to ever walk the earth. Just hands down, let's get that out of the way. It's Jesus. And I know that I believe, and I have a feeling that many of you out here in the room believe, that Jesus is the Son of God. He is who he says he is. He came to fulfill the promises of the Father given to the people. He came and he was killed, he was buried and resurrected. And it's because of this we have hope. We have new life. It changes us in the present as well, right? Because these facts change things. They matter. They change the way we read about him in this book. They change the way that we understand the things that he did and the things that he said. And that leads us to reminder number 2, is that in this series, we've gathered a couple sayings together. We've isolated them, not from the text of Scripture because we want to take it out of context or make it mean something it doesn't, but because they all have a common denominator. And it's that there's certain sayings that are just difficult. Not difficult to understand, to cognitively understand, but sayings that are difficult to take, difficult to work with, difficult to implement in our life. You see, we've all come to Jesus like the rich young ruler. We've come to Jesus and we say, Jesus, I know what you said, I know what you told us to do, and I've done it ever since I was a small child. There's some out there in the room that can attest to this, and maybe you are that person. You've done so many good things. You bring your works before Jesus. You've lived faithfully for him. The temptations that you've foregone in order to follow him, and yet for each and every one of us, there's something kicked under the rug. There's a teaching here, there's a teaching there that's just difficult. We say, as long as Jesus doesn't check back there, as long as he doesn't pull up that rug, we're good, because I know what's under there, and it's not good. Today, we're going to pull out one of these sayings today, and it's Jesus' command, do not judge. Now, I have to be honest with you, when Ron first gave me the assignment for this text and topic today, my first reaction was kind of like, I mean, do not judge. We get it. It's something we want to do, but how impactful is it, really? I mean, last week after Brandon talked about the exclusive claim of Jesus, that I am the only way. I mean, after that, it's kind of a downgrade to talk about just judging one another, isn't it? It's kind of a baby step after that long leap. But how significant does judgment play in our lives? See, it was a few weeks ago, my wife and I, we were traveling with the whole family back to Joplin, and the kids were in the back seat. They had the snacks, they had the headphones on, they had the TVs playing, all the stuff that you do. And we just pulled out on the highway, and every parent knows that feeling where you kind of get this final sense of peace, that they're settled, you're settled. Maybe you get to talk to your wife for the first time that day, first time that week, really a good conversation. And Ariel, my wife, looks at me. She says, what are you preaching about in a few weeks? And I said, do not judge. And my loving wife looks at me and says, that ought to be a good one for you. Yeah, my reaction wasn't quite that jubilant. But it's true, isn't it? That it's those who are closest to us that get our greatest judgment vocally. And yet those who are removed from us, those who we don't know, they're not safe from our judgment, though, are they? Maybe they don't hear it. Maybe we don't say it out loud, but it's there constantly. The technology we have, the social media that we interact with now, it just extrapolates this. It makes it all the more prevalent that it's changed judgment by making judgment more consistent and available than ever. You pull out your phone, you open up an app, and you just begin scrolling through the feed, judging what comments are worthy of your like and which ones aren't that valuable. We compare our stories to other people's stories, and it's all about value judgments. How can I make my life look so much better? Because I know people are judging me, and I'm judging them. And I don't say all of this to condemn social media or any other medium. You see, that's not the point. The point is that we have a judgment problem that we need to wrestle with. Somewhere deep down in our fleshly nature, we wrestle with this problem to look better than we are, that others, we think they look better than they really are. What do we do with that? You see, I think Jesus speaks into this situation. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 7 today, beginning in verse 1. But before we get to the text, let me just make a couple notes here. It's interesting what happens. Matthew chapter 7 is at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Begins in chapter 5, ends in chapter 7. And something that Matthew does when he's constructing this gospel of Jesus' life, something interesting he does at the beginning, he makes Jesus look a lot like Moses. That Moses character from the Old Testament, right? At the beginning of each of their lives, they feared for their lives as infants. It was Herod for Jesus. For Moses, it was Pharaoh. They both fled and left Egypt. They both had the experience of going out in the wilderness, Jesus for 40 days, Moses 40 years. And then the first big moment in Moses' life is he received the law up on a mountain, Mount Sinai, and he gave it to the people. It's this magnificent giving of the law. And Jesus here at the beginning of his ministry, Matthew places these 3 chapters of Jesus' teaching because this is the Sermon on the Mount, up on a mountain. And you say, well, what does this mean? Pointing these things out, what does that do for us as we're reading our text today? And it's this, because if you go back in the Old Testament, you look at the law given by Moses, the closer you look, the more you see it's not just a list of do's and don'ts. You see, the law was meant to reflect the character and the nature of the lawgiver. And the community in which the lawgiver puts this law on, it's because he cares for them and he wants them to begin to look like him. You see, it's not just do's and don'ts, it's who are we becoming like. And with that frame of reference, let's read Jesus' words together. In verse 1, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye, you hypocrite? First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. You see, Jesus begins with the imperative, don't judge, do not judge. And so it kind of begs the question we have to ask ourselves, what type of judgment is there really allowed for a Christian? I think we all recognize that it's God who sits on the eternal throne, and so for us to make judgments about people's destiny is maybe outside of our perspective. But how do we judge one another in the here and now? And I think we'd be quite surprised to see that Jesus actually says we are to judge one another. And it doesn't take us very long to get to it. Just look down in verse 16. Jesus is talking about how false teachers come into the community, disrupt the community, and he's saying, how do we recognize these false teachers? How do you spot them? And taking a line from John the Baptist earlier in the gospel, he says, by their fruit you will recognize them. Well, church, how do we recognize fruit? What do you do when you go to the store? You pick up an apple, you're choosing a bunch of bananas. What do? You look at them. You look at the bruises. You make sure there's no big gashes or anything. What do you do when you pick up a carton of strawberries, right? You just look at the top of it? No. Turn that thing over. Make sure there's no white fuzzy stuff down there at the bottom waiting for you, right? You make sure they're juicy and plump and ready to go. And it's the same thing we do with our Christian life. There is a place when we judge one another's fruits to build up the community. Jesus would reiterate this over and over, but let's look at another context. You have Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's something happening in the church there, and it's not necessarily unique to the church. It's called sexual immorality. And yet what might be unique in their case is that this sexual immorality is being lauded. It's not being hidden, it's up front. They're vocal about it, and Paul writes to them in chapter 5, and he says, what on earth are you guys doing? Why are these people still among you? Paul would say that though I'm not with you in person, I'm with you in spirit. And he says this, I've already judged them. The connotation is that by the time I get there, they need to be gone. You see, this is the point of community. We might call it accountability, but the point is that we are called biblically to examine ourselves and one another. It's the purpose of community, that we're to build one another up, to encourage one another, but there's also a point in which sometimes we must be challenged. And then in the case when someone comes into the community and they're toxic, and their toxicity emanates to everybody else around them, sometimes they need to go, maybe not forever, but for a period. You see, we are called to judge. And so what does this mean when we read in verse 1 from Jesus, do not judge? And this is where Matthew does us that great service of paralleling Jesus with Moses, Jesus' sermon on the law with Moses' teaching of the law. Because it forces us to ask a different question. See, the question we come to the text with is this: what does it mean to not judge? But Jesus forces us to ask a new question: what does not judging teach me about God? See, I'm convinced this is the question the text asks us to wrestle with. Let me show you what I mean. Look again in verse 2. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. Notice the second half of that phrase there. It's in the passive. It's not the judgment we're doing, but the judgment that is done to us. This is a basic part of the Christian experience, that we recognize that God sits on the throne and we don't. That He has the authority, He has the power to judge His creation and hold them accountable for their intended purpose. And yet sometimes we take this reality, the significance of God's character, and it gets twisted in our minds a little bit. God becomes vindictive. He's just waiting for us to mess up. Or He sees our whole past litany of sins and He holds them over our heads and we can't get out from under them. It's twisted sometimes, the way that we perceive God, and yet we have to remember that the God of this book, the one who sits on the throne, is the same one who sent His Son. You see, it's John 3:16. For God so loved the world. You see, it was love, it was grace over judgment. We're called to encounter God in this text, a God who favors mercy over rules, a God who favors grace over judgment. And I truly believe that this passage asks us to come face to face with God. We just got out of a series called Closer, right? We were looking intently at the words of Jesus. We were saying if we can draw closer to Him and look at Him long enough, maybe we'll begin to look like Him. I can't help but think it's the same idea in our passage this morning. In fact, Jesus gives it away earlier in the sermon. In chapter 5, verse 47, He says this: be perfect. Why? Because your heavenly Father is perfect. And so what do we do with this, though? If this isn't just a do this, or rather don't do this saying, and rather a look at God and become like Him, what do we do? How do we take this in? Jesus begins with an imperative, and so let's add 3 more to it to help explain it. The first is this: don't forget God's grace in your life. I know what you're thinking. Chase, hold on a second. We're talking about judgment, our actions, how they affect somebody else. We're not talking about God's grace on our life. Aren't we looking at it backwards? But you see, listen to Jesus' logic again in verse 2. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. It's like Jesus is saying, you take the first move and let's see what happens. And so let's play it out. If we judge someone for their wrongdoing, then we're necessarily validating the idea that God gets to judge us for the times that we fall short, for our wrongdoings. If we get to judge others, God has the same role. And yet, let's play it on the other hand. If we choose to forgive, what's the next step? See, Luke chapter 6 is a parallel text in Luke talking about the same idea, and he says that if we choose to forgive, God will forgive us. And so if we judge, God will judge with the same measure, he says, as we measure with. And yet, if we choose to give grace, then grace will be coming our way from the most loving God there is. That the most loving God there only is. I love the imagery that Jesus uses when he says, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. See, Jesus is drawing from the marketplace imagery. I recognize this context. He's a balance on scales. You have weights on each side, right? And this is the imagery he's evoking here. Or maybe more specifically, it could be the artisan workshop, right? We know Jesus was a carpenter, took after Joseph. And so the measurements in which he made to make things fit right. And yet when I read this verse, I can't help but think of my favorite movie. Oh, one of my favorite movies, A Knight's Tale. It's a medieval jousting movie. It stars Heath Ledger before he was the Joker in The Dark Knight. And it's a movie, and Heath Ledger's character, he's a great jouster in the movie, and yet there's at one point where he's defeated by the antagonist, Count Adhemar. He's knocked off his horse, and he's laying flat on his back, and Count Adhemar leans over him, and he utters this judgment. He says, "You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting." In church, I can't help but see how many times I've laid flat on my back in that same respect, feeling the judgment for the actions I'd taken or didn't choose to take. Yet the beautiful news is that in our story, the antagonist doesn't get the last word. In our story, we may be weighed and we may have been measured, but what's found in our place is Christ. You see, God reached down into history. He made grace a tangible reality. He put flesh and blood around the person of Jesus, and he was there to bear our sins. You see, don't waste God's grace, church. And I think you get the point. So number 2, don't get comfortable with your faults. We all know what it's like for something to be so common to us that we forget that it's even there, right? Maybe it's a scratch on your glasses. Maybe you've had an eye procedure recently. And your vision's not the same as it was, but it's kind of the new normal, and you just get used to it. My Jeep has a big crack on the windshield. It's more than a big crack. It's a massive crack. It goes all the way across. It started, down there by the vent to defrost the windshield, and in a matter of a couple of days, it was just cracked all the way across there, but I don't even notice it anymore. It doesn't bother my field of vision. I don't recognize it. And it's not always things to do with our vision. Sometimes it's habits. Maybe you're a foot tapper. Maybe you're a finger tapper. Maybe you use certain expressions the way that you talk and people just recognize it. Maybe it's the words that you use. You have habits and someone's pointed it out to you a long time ago and it's just a silly little quirk. But what happens when the silly quirk that we don't recognize becomes something we don't recognize that isn't so silly? That might hurt people. Look at how Jesus illustrates this. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brothers, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" It's been about a month or two since my wife Ariel and I started a parenting book together, and it deals with the triggers that take us from 0 to 60, from being a great Christian parent, instilling principles in our children, all the way to 60 to fits of rage. What is it that makes that move for us? And I remember reading in chapter 1 so clearly, and I remember the authors outlining how disobedience, man, it's such a trigger for us parents. It moves us to anger faster than anything else. And here's the kicker. They pointed out the long-suffering character of God throughout Scripture. They asked how many times God in our life treats us like we treat our children. Does God reprimand you at every false move you make, or do you have a life that has had grace poured all over it? You see, and I was crushed. I thought about the times even that evening after we read that chapter when I'd cut my daughter's words short in a bout of rage. I can think about the lectures then and thereafter, the angry voice, that look that you give them that says, "Daddy's frustrated." And I didn't realize that this was my go-to response at that time. You see, I hadn't even detected my own plank in my eye. Jesus' example is exaggerated and it's kind of ridiculous, but the statement that it makes about the condition of our heart is not. Number 3, don't think this process of seeing clearly is something that you can do alone. Verse 5, Jesus says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." You see, Jesus makes it sound so simple, doesn't he? If you haven't caught on to the irony and the humor yet, Jesus is saying that there's a plank in your eye, and you're trying to walk around to function with it there, and even to the point where you're trying to take a small speck out of your brother's eye, and he says it doesn't work. And yet he says, just take it out. It's that easy, just remove it, unless it's not that easy. See, when I was studying this text this week, I noticed a word Jesus uses. It's a word when he says, after you take the plank out, right, you have this clear vision. And the word that he uses there, it's used in Luke chapter 6, the parallel text, but only one other place. It's Mark chapter 8, where Jesus is in a town called Bethsaida, and some people bring a blind man to Jesus. They say, Jesus, please help heal this man. And so Jesus does what Jesus does, and he spits on the man's eyes and lays his hands on him. It's kind of a grimy miracle we don't talk about as much. Jesus says, what do you see? And he says, well, I see people, but they look like trees, and it's kind of weird. It's kind of like, well, this didn't work. We call it the two-stage miracle because Jesus, what does he do? He pads up again and puts eyes back on him, right? And he heals him. And Mark says this, then his eyes were opened, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Same word. Take the plank out of your eye, and you'll see clearly. And I can't help but wonder if something which the way in Jesus is talking, what he's meaning, is that we can't do it alone. You see, there's a part to regaining this correct vision regarding judgment or anything else, this correct vision in order to see God and look like him, that we can't do it all by ourselves. And church, this is the focus I want us to take home with us today. This is the focus to take all the way home, because I know as we get out of here, we're going to get back with our lives, so to speak. We're going to let God in, but we're going to be with family and coworkers. We're going to be eating. The work and the pressures of life is going to be back on us. And I know this isn't what we talk about in church, right? Because the same way in which we act on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday is supposed to reflect the worship on Sunday mornings. It's supposed to be consistent. We're not one way here at church and one way in the office or in the car. And yet, church, I know it's a struggle because it's a struggle I deal with. I have a Google Calendar that schedules my life. I have notes around my desk at home and at the church here that tell me things that need to be done. And if there's something I need to do, I can make a note and I can get to it. But what if what you need done most isn't something that you can do by yourself? What if there's things, church, that we can't fix on our own? You see, when Jesus says do not judge, he's pointing to an ideal that we can't reach without his help. We can't cut enough mustard and do it on our own, but he says, if you look in his full and wonderful face, you might just begin to see clearly. If you let his hands guide your own hands, think of the potter's wheel here, a teacher helping you out. If you let his hands guide your own, then you might just be able to lead with grace and end with grace and have grace across the board, because, see, you might see him and begin to look like him. So I leave it here, church, that if we can see him correctly, we allow him to change our vision, then we might just judge like our Father in heaven.